Hello everybody, my name is Professor Rich and today we're learning English. Today's topic is about how natives learn languages, that is, how we learn our first language, and we're going to talk about how you can use that information to learn a second language. In other words, as learners of English, how can you benefit from knowing how people learn languages? I'm quite excited about the class today. We have quite a lot of very interesting information to talk about. So, let's begin. The first question you may have is, why do I care how people learn their first language? Well, most of what we know about second language acquisition comes from studying first language acquisition. What do we mean by acquisition? So acquisition is getting something. Like if we talk about the acquisition of food, that means getting food from the supermarket, for example. Second language acquisition is talking about you learning English. And first language acquisition is talking about how I learnt English when I was a baby and a small child, and how you learned your first language. So once again, most of what we know about second language acquisition comes from studying first language acquisition. So of course we should care. Now, there is another point that I want to mention before we begin, and that is, everyone knows learning languages is hard. By which I mean, learning languages as an adult or even a teenager is difficult. Anyone who tells you it's not difficult is either a magician or a liar. It's definitely difficult. Now, that doesn't mean it's not enjoyable. That doesn't mean it's not fun, enjoyable, maybe even for some people, it's easier than for others. However, it is certainly not something that is very easy for anyone. It's not. If you learn a language, that's a really big achievement. Don't let anyone tell you that it's not. Now, I'm going to show you a list of errors in English. So I'm going to show you a list of sentences with problems, and I would like you to look at those problems, look at the sentences, and I want you to tell me, do you think each of these errors were made by English learners or children? So look at each of the errors and tell me, are they errors made by English learners like yourself, or are they errors made by English children learning English? So let's have a look. So we got 1, I should. 2, I finded my cat. 3, put light. 4, go me to the bathroom before you go. I going come in 14 minutes. I don't want to go to your Ammy. Sue making more coffee for Mary. Rob eat a lot. So let's have a look at these so-called English mistakes. And I want to know which of those are mistakes made by students, language learners like you, and which of them are mistakes made by English children. Which do you think? And I'll take this as an opportunity to say hello to everybody. Hello to Tetsuro. And hello to Sleepwalker. Hello to Shibi. Hello, Enrique Gonzalez. And Sleepwalker starts us off with the comment, can be both children and learners. So do you think all of these could be children or learners, Sleepwalker? Is that right? While you look at those sentences, you can also consider what exactly is the problem with each one. Do any of those sentences look correct to you? Or can you see the problem that each of them has? So we've got a nice little list here from Shimi, who says 1 is a child, 2 adult. So really we're talking native child versus adult learner. That's the point. So it's an English child versus a non-English adult. So we're talking about the difference between natives learning and students learning. So I'm going to tell you now that all of these specific errors are from native children. So these are all errors made by native children. Do any of them look similar to the kind of errors that you make? So these are all errors made by native children. We can also consider what exactly is wrong in each case. So number 1, I should. What do you think is the problem there? So the problem is that I should is a transitive verb. We need to have a subject. So we need to shut something. You can't shut without an object. We need to have an object. What do you shut? I shut the door, for example. I finded my cat, number 2. What's the problem there? The problem is, of course, find is an irregular verb, so we should use found. Put light. So this seems like an attempt at the phrasal verb put on, and also we're missing the article for light. Put the light on, for example, or even put a light on. It's too dark. Can you put a light on? Or it's too dark. Put the light on. Now, number 4 is very interesting. Look at number 4. What do you think has happened there? Has anyone got any ideas about number 4? What do you think is the problem there? And Manuel's just joining us now, saying, hello, I'm late. Enrique says, as children, we first learn the general rule and later the irregularities. Yes, there's some truth to that, Enrique. And even more interesting is it does seem that babies are born with some rules already. Obviously, this is an ongoing conversation between linguists. However, it does seem like the idea of some kind of innate grammar, which we are born with, that does seem to be the correct model. Now, there's a very interesting comment here from Shimi who says, take me to the bathroom before you go. So Shimi's changed the word go for take. Isn't that interesting? So let me explain with number 4. This is a very common type of error for children. And what it is that the child is trying to use go like a causative. It's this kind of verb that can be used both ways, right? So there are some verbs that can be used both ways. Like we can say, the plant grows and I grow the plant. I grow the plant grows. So it's like you can use the same verb with the active grammar, but it seems like a passive, right? So the plant grows, I grow the plant. We can use it both ways, you see, where the plant is the subject or the plant is the object. I grow the plant grows. And the child has tried to use the word go in that way. So it's like saying, grow the plant before I grow the plant, or something like that. Or grow me before you grow you, or something. Right? But obviously, we can't use the word go like that in English. However, here's an interesting thing for you. There are languages where go can be used like that, where go is a causative verb. So it's a very interesting error because it seems to indicate something about what children know before they learn their first language, because they try to guess that this is possible. And in some languages, it is possible, but not in English. All right, number 5, we're missing the auxiliary verb. So I'm going to come. So we are missing am and to. Now, number 6, what's going on there? I don't want to go to your Ami. Yes, ergative verbs is another word for it. What do you think about number 6, your Ami? So Sleepwalker thinks that it's arms, so there's a mistake with the vocabulary. That's possible. Let's see if anyone's got it. Your Ami. What is Ami? Yeah, exactly, Pallavi. Amenities. Okay, no one's got it. So I'll tell you. It's from Miami. So the child from Miami, learning about Miami, has thought that Miami means my Ami. And is saying, I don't want to go to your Ami. And actually, we see lots of this kind of error from children. I don't want to go to your Ami. There's another one, which is, I'll read it. You may or may not understand it. But it's something like, Daddy, when you go tinkle, you're an 8. When I go tinkle, am I an 8? You are an 8. And this comes from urinate, which means to pee. This is a real sentence that a child in a study said. So from urinate, which means pee, the child has changed that to you're an 8 and then asks the question, am I an 8? So you can see how it's very interesting how native children learn listening to the sounds, and they don't necessarily distinguish the words, the individual words correctly. And they kind of over-apply the grammar. Number 7, Sue making more coffee for Mary. So again, we're missing the auxiliary. And number 8, Rob eat a lot. Super common error for both native children and non-native learners is missing the third person S. It's one of the most common errors which language learners make. Pallavi, we're all children to Manuel. So, let's begin at the start of life of a baby, a native baby. So this is something quite interesting. Babies prefer their native language very early on. And specifically, they prefer the intonation, stress, and timing of the language their mother speaks. We know that it's the intonation, stress, and timing they prefer because you can muffle the sounds. So you muffle the sounds so they can't hear the consonants and vowels, but they still prefer that language. For example, it will sound like this. Hello everybody, my name is Rich and I'm speaking English to you with muffled sounds. Right, so it's kind of like that. You can hear this kind of... It's got the stress and the timing and the intonation. And babies actually prefer this at 4 days old. So we can study babies which are 4 days old. And there's a very interesting experiment where they take milk from... They take milk from a device, and if they suck harder, then we know that they prefer the sounds. And with the device, they can play these different sounds, and if they play the intonation, stress, and timing of the child's mother's language, then the baby takes more milk. They take more milk. They like it, right? So French babies prefer French. German babies prefer German, English babies prefer English, and it's specifically about the intonation, stress, and timing. Now, from this, researchers hypothesize that babies actually get this from hearing their mother talk while they are in the womb. So this is evidence of some consciousness and memory of babies which are in the womb of their mother. And they learn this intonation, stress, and timing from their mothers, and then they have a preference for it at 4 days old. And we can further hypothesize this because it's a preference for the intonation, stress, and timing, not necessarily for the sounds. So it's not about the vowels and the consonants, which they can't really hear when they're inside their mother's womb. It's just the intonation, stress, and timing. So it's a very early preference. Babies are born with an ability to distinguish all of the possible sounds in all languages. However, at 10 months old, they can no longer distinguish sounds outside their own language. So Spanish babies at 10 months can no longer hear the difference between rich and reach. They sound like the same words. Rich, reach. Spanish babies at 10 months old will hear those words as the same word. Rich, reach. E. Now we know as adult language learners that we can develop the ability to hear those sounds differently later on. That is possible. And actually, it's not that difficult. You really can do it. You just need to practice just 10 minutes a day, 2 days a week, and you'll be amazed at how quick your ear develops for the different sounds of a new language. But naturally, and without trying, you won't hear the difference. Spanish babies won't hear the difference between it and E. Japanese babies at 10 months old will not hear the difference between and So, for example, reef and leaf will sound like the same word to a Japanese baby who's 10 years old. 10 months old, sorry. Reef, leaf. That will sound the same to a Japanese baby because they will not distinguish between the sound and because in Japanese they are the same sound. Now, something very interesting about babies, and I really believe that language learners can learn from this. Babies love to babble. This is one of the first things that a baby does in terms of communication is babble. These sounds are meaningless, but important. And it will sound like ba 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 ba, na 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 na, dee 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 dee. What's very interesting is babbling is very similar in all languages. Whether it's a Russian baby, Japanese baby, English baby, Brazilian baby, the babbling more or less is the same. Ba ba ba, na na na, dee dee dee. That's because these sounds are some of the easiest sounds to make with the mouth. Ba, da. These are very simple sounds to make. So most babies in most languages, born in most countries, will have a similar kind of babbling. Ba, 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 ba. Especially ba, 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 ba. Right? Now, what can we learn from this? Well, as adult learners, sometimes we need to do stuff like that. I had to practice a lot to be able to make that sound. El río recorre. No, it doesn't recorre. El perro recorre alrededor del río. That took a lot of practice for me to make the r. It's still not, my r is still not very good, but at least I can make the sound r. So yes, you need to do this. I'm not recommending that you say ba 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 ba. I'm recommending that you practice the specific sounds in English which you can't say. For example, how about j? Can you do j? Judge, judge, j, j, j. J, 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 g, 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 g. Jo, 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 jo. Ja, 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 ja. Judge. It's really good to practice those sounds because there is a muscle process involved in this. And so we need to do this. El río recorre alrededor de los roedores el cigarrillo del conductor del ferrocarril. El carrillo del conductor del ferrocarril. We pronounce the R so strong, even more. El río recorre alrededor de los roedores. Thank you, Manuel. And this is one reason why tongue twisters can be useful for language learners. Here's a good one. Here's a good one if you're like the Japanese and you find it difficult to distinguish the from the You can say this. Red lorry, yellow lorry. 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 Lorry. Red lorry, yellow lorry. You can also talk about a really red lorry or a really yellow lorry. Really red lorry, really yellow lorry. It's difficult for me. And that's good. These are like training exercises to get your muscles working. Pallavi, the rule about only English in the chat applies to communication messages. However, when someone is making a learning point or talking about something relevant to the class, then it's okay to mention something in another language as long as it's in context. And I also say this in my classes to students. I'm not against people mentioning words from another language. The point is, I don't want people in chatting or sending messages in another language, because we can't verify what they're saying, and that could be offensive or it could cause problems. So that's why we have the rule about only English. Tetsuro says it's difficult to distinguish the from the So you need to go back one step, Tetsuro, to the step when babies are listening a lot to different sounds, and you need to listen to someone saying something like leaf, reef, leaf, 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 reef, reef, leaf, reef. And you need to say, is that one or two? Or These are called minimal pairs. And if you Google minimal pairs, and then you can find some sites on the internet to help you practice that. Let me type that in the chat for you. And specifically, you want to find audio minimal pairs. So find audios of minimal pairs, and you need to listen, and you need to listen until you can hear the difference clearly. It's not really about fairness, Pallavi. It's that I have to monitor the chat for what people are saying, and I need to be able to understand what people in the chat are saying in order to ensure that the chat is a friendly environment for people to learn. I know it seems unfair that Spanish is a language which I use as examples, and it's a language I understand, and I'm sorry that I don't speak Hindi. If I did speak Hindi, then I would also use it in examples. So I'm sorry that you feel that way, but the reason is, as I explained, I just want the chat to be a friendly place. I can see and understand the examples which are being written by Manuel, and so it's okay. In addition, Manuel's a moderator, and so he's also helping to keep the chat a friendly environment. I don't like it when a stranger comes in and starts saying things in Arabic that I can't check and can't understand. And in the past, we've had people who've come in and asked people for their address or phone number or whatever, and I can't tell they're doing that because they didn't say it in English, and I don't think that's appropriate. So that's why we do that. Okay, let's move on. So here's something very interesting about babies. If we have deaf babies, so deaf means they can't hear. So babies who cannot hear, if we have deaf babies and they have parents who use sign language, right? The babies will babble with their hands. So they make meaningless but common sounds, not sounds, but they make movements with their hands which are meaningless but common in sign language. So they do like common parts of sign language. They do deaf babbling. Isn't that super interesting that even deaf babies babble? They just don't do it with their mouth. They do it with their hands. Da, 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 right? Isn't that super cool? And says something very interesting about languages. Well, in the same ways that babies who can hear understand some things even when they're a baby, this is the same for deaf babies, that they understand some things. So obviously they don't understand everything, you know? It's like, Shimi, when you see a baby and the baby's like, ba, 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 da, 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 ni, 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 like, what do you think they understand when they hear? Well, it's the same with a deaf baby. They start going, dung, 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 right? That doesn't really mean they fully understand sign language, but they are babbling, but in sign language. Now let's move on and talk about the first words. And notice I've crossed out words and said phrases. And I think you'll find this very interesting. I certainly hope so. I certainly hope so, Dan. No, not Dan. Mr. Taki. I can't remember your original handle because you keep telling it. It's nice to see you, though. Palabra cabalistica. So, these are the first words which babies say. They're often words like dada, baba, juice, car, and what is that? So, a common first word that a baby says is, what is that? What is that? What is that? What is that? Right? That's interesting, isn't it? Because that's not a word, it's a phrase. What does Professor Rich always tell you about how to learn vocabulary? Don't learn words, learn phrases. And babies agree with me. So, one of the first words that babies often say is, what is that? And we can call this a listeme, or a word chunk, or a phrase. Yeah, it's a complete sentence. It's a complete sentence. But in a baby's head, it's one thing. Because babies are just saying one thing. Da, 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 da. What is that? What is that? Right? Isn't that funny? Isn't that funny? What can we learn from that? Let's talk about the early sentences that babies say. So, one of the most common ways that babies make sentences early on is that they drop unstressed function words. So in English, you know English is a stress time language, and we stress important words. Well, they are the words that babies focus on. And then words like prepositions and things like that, they don't focus on, and they drop them. So they say things like, give big doggy cookie. Give big doggy cookie. Give big doggy cookie. Mama making cup coffee. Mama making cup coffee. Tell Dada not go. Tell Dada not go. Give big doggy cookie. Mama making cup coffee. Tell Dada not go. So here we have the early sentences of babies, and they're dropping prepositions, articles, and auxiliary verbs. Now, as adult language learners, can you tell me which type of word do you find most difficult in English? Is it prepositions? Do you find articles confusing? How about auxiliary verbs? Do you sometimes forget to put do or did or is in the wrong form or have? Well, so do babies. In fact, babies often drop them completely and they focus just on those content words. That's absolutely right, Pallavi. It's ellipsis, but it is unintentional ellipsis nonetheless. It's one of the reasons why ellipsis can exist, because these unstressed function words are actually not that important in terms of communication. And what babies care about is communication. They don't care if they have said something that's not exactly grammatically correct. It doesn't matter to them. They just want to communicate. And we're going to discover something else about that, which is also quite interesting. But before we do, let's just take a moment to show our appreciation. If you are enjoying the class today, then you do smash that like button, hit subscribe, and make sure that you join us every Saturday at 1 p.m. for a language learning class on interesting topics such as do aliens exist and how do babies learn languages. All right. Let's move on. Errors often make sense. So, when babies make errors in English, the sentence still makes sense. Most errors from young children, not only babies, but also young children, speaking any language, are often grammatical in other languages. So if a baby makes an error, like if we take this sentence, Mama making cup coffee, in another language with a word-to-word translation, that's actually a correct sentence. That's grammatically correct. So isn't that interesting that the errors that babies make are often correct in some language, even if it's not correct in their language? And they often make sense. Don't giggle me. Here we have an example of a word being used like an ergative or like a causative like before. So I giggle, that means laugh, he. And the baby's used it in a causative way. Don't giggle me. In other words, don't make me laugh. And this is probably someone tickling the baby. And then we had the example from before, go me to the bathroom. So there are some languages where the verb used for go can be used in a causative way, like in this example. In English, that's considered a mistake, because in English, that verb doesn't work like that, but there are some languages where it does. And perhaps there's something innate in babies that means they make this kind of mistake. Now, one thing we should say about children is that they are possibly grammar geniuses. And we can say that children, small children who are 2 years old, may not be able to do a simple logical task like put things in order of size. So this is small, this is bigger, and then this is bigger, right? Now for an adult, it's very easy to say small, medium, big. However, a child, a 1-year-old or 18 months old, can find that quite difficult. However, they can do amazing things with language. So they display these incredible logical abilities with language, but they can't do it with other tasks, which is quite interesting. And we can see this in the example here. Children who are aged 2 to 3 go very quickly from give milk mummy to look at that train Ursula bought, or train coming here in 15 minutes. Isn't that interesting? That's a massive jump in 1 year. Within that year, they go from give milk mummy to Look at that train Ursula bought. I mean, that's quite a complex sentence. It's got all the correct prepositions as well, you'll notice at this stage. Look at that train Ursula bought. We have the irregular past used as a reduced participle clause. It's Dan's favorite sentence, or Dan's favorite type of phrase or clause, a reduced participle clause. Look at that train Ursula bought, from look at that train which Ursula bought. Super interesting. Now, here's an interesting point, and it is something that's very relevant for adult learners. Input is necessary. Input is necessary. Children who grow up in isolation do not speak. So if you have a child, and there are examples of this throughout history, and even some modern examples, children who grow up in the forest, in a cave, or they grow up in isolation without hearing people speak, they do not speak. We also have examples of deaf children from before, or children with deaf parents, and they didn't get sign language, and obviously they don't speak and they don't sign. Or even children with a curable deafness, and I'll talk about an example of those later. So without input, children don't speak, and they don't speak when they're an adult unless they receive a lot of training. And also we'll see a little later that the way they speak is quite different. So input is necessary. And guess what? It's also necessary for you as an adult learner. Input, especially comprehensible input or input in context, is super important for learning a language. Let's talk about how people talk to babies, because it's true that the way people talk to babies is different than how they talk to each other as adults, isn't it? When you talk to a baby, you don't just talk to the baby like you talk normally. Actually, I kind of do, but I also speak, I kind of use a combination because that's just how I am. But when most people talk to babies, they speak in a special language. So researchers call this language motherese, like Chinese, Japanese. They say motherese, and it's like the way that mothers often speak to their babies. Now, motherese is different than normal speech. As you might know, think about it, like Pallavi, how would you speak to your sister's baby or whatever? How would you speak to a little baby, right? That's kind of motherese. We know that children and babies prefer motherese to adult speech. So if we do a test like before with the milk, and basically when you're sucking the milk, an audio plays, and one of the audios is normal language and the other audio is motherese, then the baby will go to the milk that gives them the motherese because they prefer it. They prefer to hear motherese rather than just the native language. Now, an important point about motherese, it is different, but it's not necessarily simple. So we think, oh, motherese is kind of like a simple version of the language. Sort of, but it's not that simple. It's not that simple. So, for example, what did he eat? That's a phrase in motherese. In motherese, we don't use the simpler but incorrect phrase of ate he what? They don't say that. That's not motherese. The motherese phrase is what did he eat? Now, what did he eat is not that easy, right? You've got a question word, and the question word is moved to the start of the phrase. We've got the auxiliary verb, and the auxiliary verb is in the past tense. And then we've got the subject inverted. So we have the subject here, and then we've got eat. And actually, eat refers to the past because of the auxiliary did. So it's a super complex phrase. What did he eat? But that is a motherese phrase. So this is how mothers will speak to their children. They'll say, what did he eat? Right? They don't say, ate he what? Yeah, the point is, Shimi, nobody says, ate he what? But if you look at in terms of simplicity, ate he what is actually a simpler way of asking the question because it has the same word order. No, it doesn't have the same word order, but it has a more logical word order than what did he eat. We could also say, he ate what? Right? But Motherese doesn't say that. Motherese says, what did he eat? Which is very complex. I mean, going from he ate it to what did he eat? Those things are totally different. He ate it. What did he eat? They're super different in terms of their structure. So it's very complicated. But that's how we speak to babies, and they do seem to understand it. So Motherese is a special language which we use to speak to babies. Babies prefer it, but it's not necessarily simple. Now then, let's talk about grammar error correction. So think about babies. And we know that they make these mistakes, like we spoke before. And Manuel's just put a lovely example. Out go the dog. Dog out da, right? Okay. So they make a lot of mistakes. But guess what? Parents, when babies are speaking, they will correct factually incorrect errors. So if the baby says, mummy is dog, then mummy says, no, mummy not dog, because mummy is correcting the factual sentence. So, daddy go work. No, daddy don't go work. Daddy stay home today, right? Parents will correct that. So the child says, Walt Disney comes here on Tuesday. And mum says, no, he does not. This is a real example from a study. Okay, so parents will correct factually incorrect errors. But what about grammatically incorrect errors? Parents rarely correct child grammar errors. Let me say that again. Parents will rarely correct child grammar errors. That means most of the time when a child makes a grammar mistake while speaking, parents will not correct it. So, mama isn't boy, he girl. And mummy says, that's right. You'll notice the child there has said he girl, but mummy doesn't correct. And yes, Kabbalistica, that includes recasting. So when it comes to grammar errors, parents will rarely correct, including recasting. I'm not sure if there's a study showing how often parents recast consciously or subconsciously, because sometimes the child will say something like, mama isn't boy, he girl, and mummy says, yes, she's a girl. And that's recasting, like Kabbalistica says. But the main point here is that parents don't seem to care that much about grammar errors from their baby, and they don't correct them. We can go further on this point. Attempts to correct grammar errors go about as well as they often do in language classes. So isn't that interesting that when we try to correct our children, our young children, we try to correct their grammar, it actually is often not successful. So here's an example where the father tries to correct their child. The child says, "Want other one spoon, Daddy?" And the father says, "You mean you want the other spoon?" "Yes, I want other one spoon, please, Daddy." "Can you say the other spoon? Other one spoon." Say other, other. Father, spoon, spoon. Father, other spoon. Child, other spoon. "Now give me other one spoon." Failure. And in this dialogue, the daddy, the father, is actually an experimenter. And he goes on to say, any further attempt to continue the correction at that point led to a very unhappy child and the look from his wife. And the look means, stop doing that, give the child the spoon, let's move on. So, grammar correction, correcting grammar errors of small children rarely works. So parents don't care, they don't do it, and when they try it, it doesn't work. Children learn phrases. So we already spoke a bit about this. I spoke about it before. Even some of the first words that children use are phrases, like, "What is that?" Or "Look at that." Look at that's another one. Like, "Daddy, Daddy, look at that," right? They say it like a word. Children don't assume that single words are verbs or nouns. Instead, they categorize noun and verb phrases. Obviously, children don't know what noun means and they don't know what verb means, but they understand the position, like daddy eat. They understand that there's something about daddy that's a different idea than eat. And they know that because we can see from the types of errors they make that they do understand what is a noun and what is a verb. And they're very good at categorizing phrases as nouns, like the big dog. So it's very rare that children will make a mistake which indicates they've thought the big dog is a verb, or that they say big the dog, right? They don't often make that kind of mistake. Instead, they'll make some other mistake, like forget the preposition, but they seem to understand that the big dog is a noun. So they understand that idea. So they understand that as a phrase is a noun. And again, this is evidence that we are naturally inclined to group words as phrases. The phrase is an individual unit of language, and we should learn languages like that. Don't break it down into individual words. Rather, consider the phrase. Now, I've said a lot of things to you about how we can learn languages in the same way babies can. However, it's important that we do address babies have advantages. And I mean to say, babies have advantages that you don't have. So let's talk about it. First of all, they get motherese. So people speak to them using this special form of the language, which is kind of slower and very friendly. And okay, it's not simple, but maybe it is simpler than adult language. So they get motherese, and motherese makes it easier for them to understand. It does increase their comprehension. And as we know, comprehensible input is important. So the stuff you hear, the input needs to be comprehensible. So they get motherese. They are totally unself-conscious about errors. And we can see that from the example from before here. The child doesn't care about the error. The child doesn't care about the error. So children, babies especially, and young children are totally unself-conscious about errors. Just like Manuel, he's totally unself-conscious about his errors as well. They are highly motivated to communicate. And this is one of the points that we use in communicative language teaching. The reason why we have the rationale of having a class of students who all talk to each other in English is that communication is motivational. And babies are highly motivated to communicate because they want daddy give milk, or, want baby go toilet, whatever, right? It's really important for babies to communicate to their parents about stuff. So they're highly motivated to communicate. So motivation can really help when you're learning a language. But babies, they naturally have a very high motivation. So it's not like when you go, I just can't be bothered learning any more English. Well, as a baby, if you don't learn English, that means you go hungry or you go poo-poo and nobody knows, right? So it's really important for babies to know, to try to communicate. And so they do. They have that strong motivation. And by the way, we could actually think of that as extrinsic motivation, because it's motivation coming from an external source, a need for food, for example. But it's still very helpful for babies to be so motivated to do that. In fact, it's critical. The other point we could make is that babies have no first language to cause interference. This is something called first language interference, which is when language learners make the kind of error which seems to be from their first language. Like, for example, when a Spanish person says, "I'm very constipated," which in Spanish means you have a cold, but in English means you can't go to the toilet. So we would call that an error that's caused by first language interference. Babies don't have any first language interference because obviously it is their first language. And yes, in this case, first language means mother tongue. Pronunciation is the most difficult. Worthwhile saying, only a very small percentage of adult learners don't have an accent. And this includes people who have learnt another language or spoke another language for 60 years, 50 years, 40 years. You go to the United States when you're 17, and then we record you speaking at 77, and you still have a foreign accent. That is very common. In fact, it's the most usual situation. So actually getting rid of a foreign accent is basically impossible. Some exceptional individuals can do it, but it's highly unusual. So the most difficult thing is the phonology. Even teenagers who arrive to a new country at 14 to 15 usually have a somewhat foreign accent, and there's some famous examples of that. So, let's talk about fossilized errors. Because basically, by talking about accent, what I'm really saying to you is, doesn't matter if you have an accent, because it's basically impossible to get rid of it. Basically impossible. So don't care, right? Work on the things you can change. Don't focus on the things you can't. Another point I want to make is about fossilized errors. So a fossilized error is an error which is part of your natural speech and you don't really realize it's an error, or you make the mistake all the time. A very common example with Spanish speakers is from L1 interference, and it's the error the people. So Spanish people will often say the people instead of people. Like in English, we might say, what's wrong with people? And a Spanish speaker of English will say, what's wrong with the people? So we have that fossilized error of the people. Almost all adult learners have some fossilized errors. So we can take a study. We can take 10,000 people who speak another language. We check that language and we will find some fossilized errors. You can't eliminate them. Even with intensive study, often you cannot eliminate them. I'm not saying that you should totally ignore them, but I am saying don't focus on them because they are inevitable. You cannot avoid fossilized errors, essentially. So we'll just talk a little bit about this case. This case is a woman called Chelsea. So when Chelsea was born, some incompetent doctors thought that she was mentally retarded. That's the term the doctors used, by the way. Sorry if that term causes offense, but this is a direct quote. So as a baby, they thought this. However, at age 31, she was diagnosed with curable deafness. So she was deaf, but they could cure it. And they did cure it. And then she learned how to speak. So they taught her how to speak. And the way she speaks is very unusual. So this is someone, we have the case here of a baby who did not learn a first language, but then learnt their first language at 31 after being deaf their whole life. And this is how she speaks. The small are the hat, breakfast eating girl. The woman is bus the going. So I think one of the things from this that we can realize, or that we can conclude, is it is really critical to learn our language when you're a baby. Babies who do not learn any language have some real problems learning languages later on. So we should be very thankful to our first language. You might get frustrated about how you make Japanese style mistakes in English, or how if you're Vietnamese, you often drop the consonants at the end of words. That might be frustrating, but it's much better for you that you do have a native language, because you can learn English more effectively than an adult with no language from the start. And of course, it's too late to be a baby. So normal language development is guaranteed up to the age of 6. After that, the ability to perfectly acquire native language degrades and continues to degrade. So there is a definite decrease in our ability to purely learn a language from the age of 6 all throughout our life. And primarily this happens later on in life with the decrease of neuroplasticity, which actually means our ability to learn anything new decreases over time and continues to decrease throughout our life. I'm not saying this to demotivate anyone. I'm just saying it's a fact, and it's something that we have to work with. So we're aware of it, and we will work with it, and we will succeed in our learning goals in spite of this fact. So let's talk about the implications, because, I've talked a lot about all these different anecdotes and scientific information about how babies learn languages and so on. But what does this mean for you as a language learner? And this is quite an important part. So, first, we might consider how to be like a baby. So, be motivated to communicate. Talk to people you want to talk to. Study a course with English as a language of instruction. If you really enjoy learning about history, then learn about history in English. If you really love watching Star Trek, then watch Star Trek in English. Be motivated to communicate. Don't worry if you aren't listening to perfect native English. A big thing that non-native learners have is they always want to speak to the teacher. They want the teacher, the native teacher, to talk to them. But actually, you don't need that. Babies learn from motherese. And motherese is not perfect native English. Motherese is a simplified, kind of slower, special version of English. So this means that, yes, if you're Spanish and you speak to a German in English, you can learn from them. That is good practice in communication. So don't worry if you aren't listening to perfect native English. Babies don't, and it doesn't matter. Do not care about making mistakes. Babies don't care about mistakes. Their parents don't care about mistakes. And by the way, I mean grammar mistakes here, not factual mistakes. They're different. So grammar mistakes, less important. Focus on communication, focus on factual mistakes. And then learn phrases. As we know, even from a few months old, babies learn phrases, not individual words. They focus on the phrase of meaning. Dada, mama, what that? Look at that. And then we've taken the positives. Let's talk about the limitations. We will have some fossilized errors. Our phonology, which I mean our pronunciation, will never be perfect. Do not obsess about error correction because, one, it doesn't work. Two, there are other ways to improve your English which are better. Babies do improve their English. They do learn about prepositions, they do learn about articles, and they do start to use them correctly. But that doesn't happen because of error correction. It happens through meaningful communication and comprehensible input. And again, I'm not suggesting that we eliminate error correction. I'm just saying that it's less important than many learners emphasize. Here's the reference for today. So most of this lesson today was built on the book First Steps, the book In the Language Instinct, The New Science of Language and Mind. Specifically, the chapter Baby Born Talking Describes Heaven by Steven Pinker. You can find that chapter on page 262 to 296. You should be able to find that book in any self-respecting English library or linguistics library if you want to read more about it. So thank you very much for joining me for today's lecture, everybody. You can, of course, download the notes, as always, from the link Like a Native, which is now posted in the chat, and in just a few moments will be available down below the video. And that, of course, brings us on to question time. So if you have any questions about today's class, about language learning, or about English in general, now is the time to ask them. I don't have long today, so please do ask those questions right away, and I'll do my best to answer them. And Nilathi B has just arrived and says hi. Hello there, Nilathi. We are just finishing up, but if you have any questions about learning English, feel free to type those in the chat, and I'll do my best to help you with them. Got an interesting comment here about Spanish from Manuel, saying that the z and s is only well pronounced in the middle of the Spanish mainland, Castile, Espanol. Z and s. Interesting. What do you mean by well pronounced, Manuel? Because for me, the correct pronunciation of Z in Spanish is like cazar, cazar, cazador. Is that correct? Cazador. Zaragoza. It's Zaragoza, right? Zaragoza. For me, that's the correct pronunciation. Zaragoza. Zaragoza is a town in Spain, by the way, for people listening. Eliza says, quite interesting. Thank you. Of course, Eliza, you're welcome. Do you have any questions about English that I can help with? Kabbalistica says, the higher the language proficiency, the more idiomatic it is. As a general rule, that's true. So the more proficient your language, the more idiomatic phrases you will use. Also related to idiomatic phrases and idiomatic parts of language, it's highly related to time. So the older the language, the more idiomatic it is. So newer languages tend to be less idiomatic than older languages. In addition, the older a person is, the more idiomatic they speak their native language. So 75-year-olds use more idiomatic language than 14-year-olds, for example. So the older we get, the more idiomatic we become. But anyway, to answer your question directly, I would say yes, as a general rule. Pallavi wants to know about IELTS Speaking Task Live. You know, let me show you, Pallavi. I've had this slide in my notes for like the past 3 weeks, and I always have the intention of doing some live IELTS, but then I just get too tired when it comes to question time. I mean, I can actually feel like my throat feels a bit strained. I feel kind of tired. And I think we're going to have to wait until I start doing 2 streams a week again before I can give time to that kind of live practice. I would like to do it, and I enjoy doing it, and I know it's beneficial for people, but not today. Maybe I need to rethink the plan with that. Manuel says Zaragoza and Cazador. Like the Latin American accent. I mean, if that's the traditionally correct one, that's quite interesting. And that reminds me a little bit of the differences between American English and British English, where in American English, they will often say the sound at the end of words, which end in an R. For example, they say car, and they say teacher, teacher. Whereas in British English, we say car and teacher. So you have car, car, teacher, teacher. And I found out a few years ago that linguists believe the original English had the sound. So the more traditional style is actually the American way of saying it. Car is more similar to the original English pronunciation. And apparently the difference became pronounced during the American War of Independence. The British generals often spoke without the they said car. And so this became a way of differentiating how we speak. And because accent is so related to identity, and at that time in history, the important difference in identity was, am I a rebel fighting for my free country, or am I loyal to the king or queen? Then we started to integrate this difference into the language. It became prestigious in British English to drop the R sound. Car started to sound more British. And British people didn't want to sound like the Americans using car. And so they dropped it. You could do the lesson for 3 days, maybe. Cutting it short would help. You could do the one lesson for 3 days, maybe. Cutting it short would help. Totally confused. Sorry, Shimi. I didn't get it. Hey, it's Gus, of course. Hi, Gus. Yes, of course I remember you. It's just, I remembered the three-letter name, and I just couldn't remember the first letter, so I couldn't remember. But yes, I should remember you from your famous role in Breaking Bad. I believe you played the antagonist for the penultimate series. Of course. You know, I'm a big fan of combining writing, reading, listening, and speaking all together. And I think it's useful to spend time on all 4 skills. However, well, I'd need to know about the sort of individual practices which you wanted to talk about with regards to combining writing and pronunciation before I could comment on what I personally and professionally think about their utility. I think for me, it was very useful for me to write and speak Spanish at the same time while I practiced it, because Spanish is largely phonetic. It's not totally phonetic, but it's much more phonetic than English. However, in Vietnamese, I don't do it. I just focus on speaking and the sounds. And I'm going to continue doing that for a number of reasons, but not least of all because I'm interested to see how it goes. Not focusing on the written form at all, but focusing as much as possible on the sounds and just speaking. Ah, yes, of course. As they say, Andalusia. But in my Spanish accent, we say Andalucía. Would you like me to talk about modernism and postmodernism? Yes, I would love to hear about modernism and postmodernism. By the way, I don't fully understand postmodernism, but I pretty much disagree with every single postmodern... No, that's not true. I pretty much disagree with a large amount of the conclusions made by postmodernists. However, I think there is some value in the proposition of postmodernism. Postmodernism is basically about deconstruction. And I think deconstruction is interesting. However, I just can't stand the conclusions that they come to. And I don't think they're useful or pragmatic or natural or good. In fact. Yes, water's wild. The Americans say, water, water. And the Brits say, water. Or water. Water, water. Versus water, water. Even water, 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 water. Thank you, Gus. That's a lovely compliment. I'm trying my best to find interesting topics and interesting discussions to have. And I might as well tell you guys, I have entered once again into the realm of academia. I am once again an academic, and I'm quite happy to be so. And I am studying at the moment, and this class was based on this text, which is the text which I just referenced in the previous slide. And you can see some of my notes on the text here. I like to scribble, cover my text in highlights while I'm reading. So that was my material for today. And then I'm going to read this afterwards. Tetsuro says, in the world there are a variety of Englishes which have different pronunciations, so can we think about standard English? So there is no standard English. However, I do think that students like to have a standard, and it can be useful for students to have a standard. I would recommend British or American, and I know that's very Anglo-centric, but it is English after all. And most of the time I find that students actually enjoy learning about the history and culture of the country and the language that they're learning. So personally, I often present British English as the standard, and I think you can look at that as a useful standard and learn that. British English is widely respected all over the world. It's rarely stigmatized. So if you are concerned about how you're perceived British English is a very good standard to have, especially as a non-native speaker. There are some accents which are stigmatized. We can comment socially on whether that's fair or not or whatever, but there are accents that are stigmatized. And so as a language learner, you might care more about that, and you might wish to learn a language which is less stigmatized. British English is one. French English is another, especially if you're a lady. The French accent in English is considered sophisticated and even desirable. So that's something to think about. And I've met Spanish women actually who speak with a French accent because they had a French teacher who taught them English. So, you know, it is possible. That would mean that you say like oh instead of r, right? So instead of rich, you'd say rich, rich, instead of rich. That's French English. Rich, rich, restaurant. Have you been to this French restaurant? Have you been to this French restaurant? It's nice. But yes, you might wish to choose British English. Of course, I'm biased. Yeah, that's a good attitude to have in terms of learning English. Find the things that you like and do that. I also recommend podcasts. Find a podcast in English which you like. There's so many of them out there and they are fantastic and you can learn stuff. Yeah, I thought about that, Shimi. I think that's possible. And even I have a break screen, don't I? I've got this. I just don't use it. Yeah, I'll think about it. I mean, that is kind of my intention. But, you know, life, busy, got things to do. Perhaps if the channel was a little bit more successful, then I could justify spending more time on it. But, you know, bills to pay, mouths to feed, and so on. Yeah, that's super interesting, isn't it? It is, Gus, but slowly, isn't it? I mean, we gain about 120 subscribers a month. So that's around 1,500 subscribers a year. You know, it's not bad. Some people say American English is standard. We have pronunciations tests in Japan. However, I'm not willing to agree with it. American English is standard. There is, I mean, people will say all kinds, Tetsuro. Actually, a lot of academics now, and for the last 10 years, they will say that international English is the standard because there are 3 times as many non-native speakers as there are native speakers. So actually, international English is more standard than anything. So it's not really a question of standard. It's a question of stigma. Video games, for sure, is my number 2 hobby. And my favorite hobby and my favorite way to spend my time is to do things with my wonderful wife. Yeah, what is standard Spanish, eh? Full marks in exam. Whoa. Read a lot. study a lot, practice the exam a lot if you can. This opinion varies a lot, Nilathi, and it depends actually on what you're exposed to. So I've had students who find American easier. I find students who find British English easier. And it's about 50-50 actually. So there's no consensus on that. It's not about which is more difficult. It just depends on the learner. And I've actually had people who prefer British English but find American easier because, you know, the first teacher they had was American, or they watch a lot of American TV or whatever. I mean, that's most common in Latin America. The vast majority of South and Central Americans speak with an American accent. I actually can't see if messages are deleted or retracted, Shimi, because I'm using software which takes the chat and puts the chat into a log, and then I click on the log and it puts it on the screen. So I just can't see it if they're deleted. I'm sorry. So I didn't realize if you had that. Just ignore it. Thank you very much, Manuel. Always appreciated. Let's have a stream of emojis. Emoji stream. Let's have a like bomb. Okay, get ready. 3, 2, 1. Everyone smash that like button and hit emojis in the chat. Emojis, emojis, emojis in the chat. Let's have emojis in the chat. Go, 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 go. Bounce those emojis around the screen. Thank you very much. Rich appreciates the coffee, Manuel. Thank you, Kabbalistica. I appreciate that a lot. And I'm enough of a terrible person to truly believe that my classes are the best on YouTube as well. The last time I got full marks on a serious exam, I was 15, and it was a maths exam, my finals, and I got 100%, the highest in the school. These days, my maths is very bad. I don't do maths exams, and I basically never get full marks on exams now. I mean, when you're in higher education, it's extremely difficult to get full marks on exams because the exams aren't designed to be full marks exams. Oh, really? I have 2 Brazilian students at the moment. In fact, they might be watching. Hello, obrigado, obrigado. My Brazilian is not very good. They're very, very, very funny ladies. They don't like the fact that the adjective American is used for people from the United States because they consider themselves to be Americans because they're from Brazil. And it's the continent of America, which I found very interesting. I mean, that definitely helps. Nialathi, you know. But, you know, on the other side of the coin, because you're so used to the American accent, then it can be very interesting and fun to listen to the English accent because, I mean, personally, I find it interesting to hear different accents. When I hear someone speaking Spanish in a new accent, it's kind of, I want to hear it. I'm like, wow, that's interesting. What an interesting accent. And I encourage you as language learners to develop that curiosity for accents. Pero está muy rico. In Valencia, they say it. Está muy rica la paella, eh? Está muy rica la paella, eh? Está muy rica. Madre, qué rica está. Oh, wait, that's not good. La paella. Digo la paella. Oh, that's fantastic to hear, Gus. That's fantastic to hear. If you want any recommendations, I can try my best. I tell you what, though, I know that Brazil has some political problems, but what a lovely country. I've never visited, but my Brazilian students tell me all about it, and it just sounds so fantastic. And I would so love to visit Brazil one day. Oh, absolutely phenomenal. I would love to visit Brazil. I've heard the expression, there's heaven and then there's Brazil. All right. Thank you very much for joining me today, everybody. My name has been Professor Rich. Today we have been learning about how babies and how natives learn their language and what that means for you as languages. If you have enjoyed the class for today, then make sure that you smash that like button or you post a comment down below. You can post a recommendation for a future class down below if you wish. You can also support the channel by smashing that little link down below the video that says buy Rich a coffee. And if you do that, as I've said before, I will take and do any reasonable request for a future class in English. So you do buy the ability to make requests. And by this point, Manuel Gordillo has about 100 requests to make should he wish. However, being the lover of chaos that he is, I think he enjoys just letting me fly off and do lessons on whatever. So thank you very much, everybody. And I will join you next time. Have a lovely weekend. God bless.